Good day. There's been less information from the Ukrainian battlefronts over the last 24 hours, probably because, to some extent, the various reporters who report on this fighting have become distracted or are refocusing on the current tensions in the Middle East, where there's ongoing fighting, or at least exchanges of fire in Israel and with the Palestinian territories, and of course the crisis in Taiwan, or in and around Taiwan, continues to attract a great deal of attention. A further reason, I suspect, and I've touched on this before, is that I suspect that over the last couple of hours, the Russian forces have been busy consolidating the gains that they have made in the Donetsk region. They've been probably using the last few hours to move forward artillery, to clear mines left over by Ukrainian forces, to redeploy, in other words, in order to exploit their gains by making further advances over the next few hours and days. And I would add also that, as is also the pattern in this kind of fighting, with events now taking a very decisive turn, I suspect that the Russian authorities have again tightened their grip, their information control over some of the reporters who are operating on the front lines. They've been probably told that information at this time is sensitive and that they should not report it further. However, we are getting some information, and it does seem that the Ukrainian lines opposite Donetsk city, are being pushed further back, with the Russians now in control of about 3/4 of Marinka. They seem to have taken control of Pesky, as I discussed in my video yesterday. And of course, they're also busy, the Russians are also busy working on the larger, more important, more heavily fortified settlement of Avdiivka, which will undoubtedly, however, take much longer to clear. In my opinion, and again I speak about this as somebody who's in no sense a military expert, the major focus of the fighting over the next few days, and probably weeks, is going to be Bakhmut city. This is a city of around 70,000 people, or at least that was its population before the fighting began in February. So it's far from being an insignificant place, but the most important thing about it is that it is the linchpin, or so it seems to me, the key defense point holding together the Ukrainian defense line, which runs from Siversk in the north all the way through to Bakhmut via Soledar. Soledar is a suburb of Bakhmut, but it's sometimes spoken of as if it was an independent town, or a small town, and which this defense line could be said to connect all the way further south towards places like Avdiivka, the line opposite Donetsk, which we've just been talking about over the last few days. The Russians are able to capture Bakhmut, which, by the way, I've no doubt they will. Then it seems to me that this entire line starts to collapse, and collapse fairly quickly. And after that, I suspect that it is going to be extremely difficult for the Ukrainians to hold on to any other part of this line. So to give an example, directly after the fall of the important city of Lysychansk in Lugansk region, there was a great deal of speculation that the major focus of the Russian offensive, the next place that the Russians would focus upon, would be the town of Siversk in the north. And those of you who have been following my videos or who indeed follow the news closely, from the various sources, the various reporters who report about the fighting in Donbass in Ukraine, will know that on 2 occasions there were claims made by some people, some of the officials in Lugansk region, that the Russians had actually captured Siversk. Well, it turns out that that was not actually the case. The Russians have never actually attempted to storm Siversk. And I've now come to the conclusion that a lot of these reports about Siversk were actually spread by the Russians themselves as part of what you might call a disinformation campaign. Disinformation being, of course, very much an important part of war, in order to make the Ukrainians think that Siversk would be the next Russian target. And the result was that the Ukrainians concentrated large numbers of troops in that part of the front line. Siversk, around Siversk, the military summary channel thinks that there's about 20,000 Ukrainian troops located in and around Siversk. And of course, they were all positioned there in the expectation that that was where the major Russian blow would come. In fact, it came elsewhere with his Russian attack, which firstly captured the Uglegorsk thermal power plant, some distance further south, and which has now led to this developing Russian offensive towards Bakhmut and Soledar, which is being attacked from the east and from the south. And the Russians have now broken into the city limits of both Soledar and Bakhmut. As I said yesterday, they are now known to be operating on Patrice Lumumba Street, though we don't know how much of that street they've actually captured. But we're also getting now reports that the Ukrainians are trying desperately to create fortifications within Bakhmut city itself, that they're blowing up bridges and laying roadblocks along the roads within Bakhmut, and that they're trying to turn some of the buildings in the town into some kind of fortified positions. I suspect that the Russians, for their part, whilst they'll no doubt continue the pressure, within Bakhmut, they'll continue to sort of push their forces deeper into Bakhmut. Much of their focus will be on trying to capture the road links, the villages around Bakhmut, eventually isolating Bakhmut until it falls into their hands, until it can be stormed without too much difficulty. And that's the nature of this battle in Donbass. It's been described by many people. There was a very interesting discussion of the fight in Donbass between Brian Boletich of the New Atlas and Mark Sloboda, and I've discussed myself how Donbass is far and away the most densely populated and most heavily urbanized region, probably outside Kiev and perhaps Odessa in Ukraine. The Ukrainian troops have been there for a long time. They've taken many steps to try to fortify it, to build trenches, to create bunkers and concrete installations, those sort of things. There's nothing quite like that anywhere else in Ukraine. It does mean that this battle of Donbass has much of the character of, if you like, a prolonged siege. And of course that dictates the pattern of the fighting. The Russians break through a defense line. They then haul up their artillery a bit closer to the next place. They then shell that. They then move forward. They clear the mines. Their sappers get into work. They clear the mines, and then they advance, gradually, incrementally, taking Donbass village by village, town by town, city by city, block by block, trench by trench. But as I said, in the event that Bakhmut falls, and apparently it's less defensible than some of the places that have been captured in the past, places like Popasnaya and Lysychansk, then of course that opens up the entire defense line. It makes it all untenable, and all those Ukrainian troops who are concentrated around Siversk in anticipation of the blow, which hasn't come, they would be in very serious peril, or so it seems to me from my reading of the maps, of being encircled. One could perhaps compare the importance of Bakhmut at this stage of the Battle of Donbass to the importance of Popasnaya. Popasnaya was this town in Lugansk region. It was located on heights. When the Russians were able to capture it after a prolonged fight that took 2 months, then progressively the entire defense, Ukrainian defense in Lugansk region collapsed, and we saw in succession one town after another, one defense line after another collapse, until eventually the Russians stormed through Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, and the entirety of Lugansk region became cleared of Ukrainian troops. And it seems to me that Bakhmut, though apparently a less defendable place than Popasnaya, it's not located on heights in the way that Popasnaya is, but it seems to me that Bakhmut fulfills something of the same role. Once Bakhmut falls, and we're now at the early stages of the Battle of Bakhmut, as I said, there's street fighting within the city. There's, as I said, moves by the Russians steadily to isolate it. Once Bakhmut falls, we will see the entire Ukrainian defense of Donetsk, in Donetsk region, start to unravel, just as happened in Lugansk region after the fall of Popasnaya. So this is the pattern that we see shaping out in Donetsk. I'm going to make one prediction. I think that there are probably more Ukrainian troops in totality in Donetsk region than there were in Lugansk region. But I also think that for reasons of geography, for reasons of the growing strength of Russian troop concentrations in Donetsk region, I think that once Bakhmut is cleared, we will see the collapse of Ukrainian defenses in Donetsk region faster than we saw in Lugansk region after Popasnaya fell. I mean, one obvious reason why that is the case is that, of course, at the time when the Russians were clearing Lugansk region, when they were taking Popasnaya and all of those other places, part of their forces were in Donbass, were located trying to contain the Ukrainian troops or press on the Ukrainian troops in Donetsk region. Well, with Lugansk region cleared, the Russians are able to, or so it seems to me, deploy more forces to Donetsk region than they were able to deploy in Lugansk region. They have a bigger fist, if you like, to use, and that's one reason why I think that the Battle of Donetsk region will not take as long as the Battle of Lugansk region did. And I remain of the view that we will probably see the end of this battle in Donetsk by the end of this month. The Military Summary channel spoke about the incipient collapse in his latest broadcast, the incipient collapse of the Ukrainian defense line in Donetsk region. I think that may be a little premature, but it seems to me that it's right about the general trajectory of travel. Once, as I said, Bakhmut falls, we will start to see everything start to unravel. And I would add and finish this analysis for what it's worth, that once Bakhmut falls, the Ukrainian positions in Slavyansk and Kramatorsk will become as untenable as the Ukrainian positions in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk became after Popasnaya fell. I would also say that I'm going to make a guess now, and this is my own guess. During the battles in Lugansk region, virtually everybody assumed that the Russians would attack Lysychansk first and then attack Severodonetsk, because Lysychansk is located on higher ground than Severodonetsk and would be more difficult to capture. So the assumption was that the Russians would go for Lysychansk first, and there was some surprise when instead the Russians first attacked Severodonetsk. I'm going to guess that we're going to be in for the same surprise. I think that once Bakhmut is captured, the main Russian advance will not be on Slavyansk in the north, it will be on Kramatorsk. And once further south, the sort of lower part of the Slavyansk Kramatorsk urban conglomeration. And once Kramatorsk falls, then the Russians will move on to Slavyansk. Now, all I have just said, of course, comes from someone who has no background in military affairs. But I am reading lots of things from lots of people. I listen to commentaries by many people, and I would say also that inevitably, having followed this battle so closely, one begins to get a feel for the tactics and the pattern of this battle. Now, I'm also going to say, I'm going to repeat again, once this battle of Donbass is ended, then the whole character of the war will change. We could at that point be back at much more mobile warfare with large numbers of Russian armored forces being deployed in large formations, especially east of the Dnieper River. Now, one reason why I suspect the collapse in Donetsk region is going to be faster than it was in in Lugansk region, is because, on top of the fact that the Russians look stronger than they did when they were clearing Lugansk region, because they're not having to cover so many fronts in Donbass as they did then, it does also increasingly look as if the Ukrainian military is weaker. And there's been a report, or at least what claims to be a report, which has been circulating apparently on Ukrainian channels. I presume that means Ukrainian Telegram channels, which purports to be a leaked document from the Ukrainian Defense Ministry, which supposedly describes the state of the Ukrainian military. And this report makes various claims that Ukrainian military formations, that their normal strength is around 43 to 48% of their nominal strength. Their losses have been hugely high. that there are fundamental problems refurbishing some of the weapon systems that Ukraine uses, especially those that have been provided by the West, that some of these weapon systems are difficult to maintain. Some of them apparently have to be sent back to Poland to be refurbished there, because it's very difficult or all but impossible to refurbish them in Ukraine itself. Well, I've seen this report. If you want to follow it up, you can go to the Moon of Alabama, which has published it in detail. I have to say, a bit wary of it. I mean, there are photographs of some of parts of it which do look authentic, but I do wonder again whether maybe this isn't part of a Russian disinformation exercise. I'm not going to rely on this report in any detail. I only mention it because I'm sure some people will bring it up. It seems to me a document to be treated with great skepticism until its provenance with the Ukrainian military is confirmed, which I doubt whether it ever will be. I have to say that, as I said, I'm skeptical of this document, and I'm not going to place any reliance upon it. But that the Ukrainian military has been suffering very heavy losses, I think, is indisputable. That Ukrainian military formations are no longer up to strength is also indisputable, and that the weapon systems supplied by the West to Ukraine have not always lived up to their billing. They're not been as effective as they are, and that they're maintenance heavy. Of that, I have no doubt at all. And by the way, there's been a Western media report that claims that only around a third of Western weapon systems supplied to Ukraine get through to the front lines, which I'm perfectly willing to believe as well. And I'm pretty sure that it is indeed the case that weapons have to be sent back to Poland for refurbishment and repair, because Ukraine lacks the skills to repair them within Ukraine itself. Those things, I think, are almost certainly true, but of course they're probably well known in Ukraine and amongst the Russians, and it would not be difficult, it seems to me, to put together a fairly convincing document saying all of these things, making it look like it is an official Ukrainian document, and it's plausible and probably correct in its details, but it doesn't necessarily follow that it is actually an actual genuine Ukrainian document. We are in a war, and there is a great deal of disinformation circling around. That, by the way, brings me to another topic of this nature, which is, of course, the question of the extent to which the Russians are destroying HIMARS missiles. Now, the HIMARS missile launchers. Now, the Russian Ministry of Defense claimed that it has just destroyed another HIMARS launcher in Zaporozhye region. In Kharkiv region. Now, if you accept that claim, and I, by the way, broadly do, then that brings the total number of HIMARS launchers, which the Russians claim to have destroyed, up to 7, as against 16, which have so far been delivered or are in the process of being delivered. Now, I happen to think that these are fairly reliable claims by the Russians, but it's perhaps worth saying that Ukraine itself and the United States military deny that any HIMARS systems have been destroyed by the Russians at all. So we have a major difference. The Russians say they've destroyed 7. The Ukrainians and the West say that they have destroyed none. Who is telling the truth? Well, as I've made clear, I think the Russians are probably telling the truth. It seems to me that there's no reason for the Russians to make up claims of this nature, And up to now, when they've claimed destruction of specific weapons, Ukrainian weapon systems, it's tended to be the case that Russian claims have been reasonably reliable. Perhaps they've not managed to destroy 7 HIMARS launchers, but I'm reasonably sure that they have destroyed some. Now, I'm bringing this up because a blog based apparently in Kherson has been circulating film of what it claims is another HIMARS system which has been destroyed by the Russians. And this film shows a wooded area and a missile striking some object there, and it's clearly a film taken by a drone. It's been suggested a Russian Orlan 10 drone, how am I to say, and this claims that this is a HIMARS system that is being destroyed. The film is not particularly clear. Some people have done an analysis of it, and they think that it does perhaps show the destruction of a HIMARS launcher system in Zaporozhye. The people who published this film in Kherson say that it is one of those HIMARS launchers that has been used for the missile strikes on the Antonovsky Bridge in Kherson City, near Kherson City. Who's to say? I have to say, however, that so far the Russian Ministry of Defense has not claimed the destruction of a launcher, a HIMARS launcher, in this particular part of Ukraine. So I'm going to treat this particular claim with considerable skepticism. If it's true, which of course it may be, and if all the other 7 HIMARS launchers that the Russians claim they have destroyed have indeed been destroyed, then the Russians have destroyed 8 in total out of the 16 that have been supplied, which would be, by the way, half the number of HIMARS launchers which have been supplied. But as I said, I would like to see some proof of this first. Anyway, there we are. That seems to me to be the major story on the principal front lines. Now, I'm going to again also return to this topic of the Kherson counteroffensive. This is now starting to provoke a certain degree of mockery on the part of various channels which have been covering the war. I understand even within Ukraine, the Kherson counteroffensive is becoming something of a joke. It's something people always talk about. It never seems to quite happen. I'm going to simply say this. I think that there's still a chance that Ukraine may launch some kind of offensive in Kherson region. There are now rumours, and I think these are probably very plausible and likely true rumours, that the Ukrainian High Command, the military people, are advising strongly against this counteroffensive, and that they expect it to fail. But I don't think that means necessarily that something like this might not be attempted, even though Ukraine has been making all sorts of very strange claims. I mean, they claimed the other day to have captured 50 settlements in this part of Ukraine. People have looked on the various battlefield maps that both sides have been producing for evidence that Ukraine has advanced and captured some settlements somewhere. They can't find proof of this on any of these battlefield maps, and Ukraine, of course, hasn't provided the names of any of these settlements which it claims to have recaptured in this area. So, I mean, it's all very difficult to assume. Now, having said that, there are some reports circulating now that this offensive is going to be launched tomorrow, 7th August, Sunday 7th August, probably on a much more limited scale than had been talked about a few weeks ago, but that something is going to be attempted from the 7th of August, and that there may be some reasons to think that this might be true. The first is that the governor of Nikolaev region, a person by the name of Kim, who has announced a lockdown of Nikolaev city for 3 days. And this is supposedly been done in order to round up Russian spies or people who have been passing on information in Nikolaev to the Russians. And that might be an indication that some kind of offensive is being prepared and that the Ukrainians are trying to tighten their control of information about their troop movements. The other reason for thinking that something might be up is that the Russians seem to have intensified their missile strikes, both on Nikolaev and on Kryvyi Rog, and that they've been attacking some Ukrainian military formations there, and according to the Russians, inflicting very heavy losses on these formations. And I noticed that in the latest Russian Ministry of Defense report, bulletin, they said that 3 Ukrainian military formations in this area, which had been ordered to take the offensive, have refused to do so because of the very severe losses that they have suffered. Well, that's what the Russians say. On previous occasions when the Russians have made these sort of claims, they've tended actually to be subsequently confirmed as largely true. So this could be true. But note that the Russians say that these military formations were ordered to go on the offensive. So they were ordered to go on the offensive. That would imply, presumably, that they were ordered to attack in Kherson region. So that might be the offensive that we've been talking about. Maybe the Russians launched their strike first. Maybe these Ukrainian formations have indeed then, after these strikes and after the losses that they've experienced, said to the Ukrainian High Command that we're just not in a position to carry out this offensive. And maybe the whole account is true. Or it could be that the Russians are overstating or over-assessing the effectiveness of their strikes, and maybe these military formations which have been earmarked for an offensive are indeed going to try to take the offensive, perhaps tomorrow or over the next few days. We'll just have to wait and see. What I will say is that it's now the 6th of August that I'm making this program. The time window for this Ukrainian offensive is closing. Remember, about 2 weeks ago, a Ukrainian official said that Ukraine had between 6 and 4 weeks to turn the situation round. And that Financial Times article that I was discussing in my video yesterday also suggests that if Ukraine is going to launch its blow, it can't realistically do it during the autumn and winter months. So, if this time window is so short, 6 to 4 weeks, that was said, as I said, about 2 weeks ago, we're now down to 4 to 2 weeks. So the time window for this is starting to close. According to what the Ukrainians themselves, or at least one Ukrainian official, has said. So the Ukrainians don't have a huge amount of time left to carry this out. And the Military Summary Channel yesterday made the further point, which I think seems to me is a valid one, that if Ukraine's plan is not just to retake Kherson city, but to try to drive the Russians back from their positions west of the Dnieper River, so as to make the Dnieper River their next main defense line, then again they need to do that quickly, because once the Donbass front collapses, which, as I said, looks now to be only a matter of a few weeks, then the Russians are in a position to advance all the way to the Dnieper. And of course, if they do that, and they still have troops in Kherson region west of the Dnieper, then that compromises whatever plan the Ukrainians may still have of trying to make the Dnieper their next defense line. I would add, by the way, that if the Russians reach the Dnieper somewhere around Dnipro, the city the Russians still call Dnipropetrovsk, if they're able to straighten out the lines and capture places like Zaporozhye, east of the Dnieper, then I have to say that, again, looking at the map, it seems to me that at that point, any Ukrainian offensive against Kherson city becomes not so much problematic as entirely impossible. Well, this has been a heavy discussion on military matters. Many people will say, given that I'm not, as I said, a military expert, that perhaps I'm being rather brave in giving you this analysis. But everybody's entitled to their opinion. I am, and I think that there's no harm in my setting out what I think my opinions about developments over the next few weeks and days are likely to be. Now, there's a number of further things I wanted to just touch on. The first is that over the course of that discussion that I spoke about on the new Atlas, the one between Brian Berletich and Mark Sloboda, there was a discussion of the British training program of Ukrainian troops. And if you remember, a couple of weeks ago, after Boris Johnson went to Kiev, we got reports that the British were intending to train 10,000 Ukrainian troops every 120 days. Now, what I assumed that meant was that 10,000 Ukrainian troops would be sent to Britain and would receive training over a period of 120 days. That is a 4-month period, which would provide a certain degree of training to these Ukrainian troops. I did wonder how the British would be able to organize training of so many troops, given the limited size today of the British Armed Forces, but that was my assumption. Well, on that discussion program, on the new Atlas, it was explained very differently. It was suggested that what's actually going to happen is that the British are going to provide training to 10,000 troops over 120 days, but it will be training provided to some of these troops in turn, to something like 2,000 to 2,500 troops, one at in time. So a force of around 2,000 troops, Ukrainians are numbering about 2,000, 2,500, will receive 3 weeks training in Britain, and then will be sent back to Ukraine, and then they will be replaced by another 2,000 to 2,500 troops, and so it will continue until that force of 10,000 troops has gone through this training process. That means that the total amount of time that a Ukrainian soldier, and these are, it should be said, conscripts, people taken straight out of civilian life, this has been confirmed by the British media, they will only receive around 3 weeks training before they're sent back to Ukraine. And it was said on the new Atlas that this is nowhere near enough to provide even minimal training to troops who are going to be sent into battle. Now, both of the two people on that discussion programme, Brian Beletic and Mark Sloboda, have military backgrounds. I don't. And they were able to compare their training, their military training, the length of their training with this 3 weeks that these Ukrainian soldiers are going to receive in Britain. And they said that this was cruel and this was hopelessly inadequate for the needs of a war. Now, I have never received military training of any kind. I can say this, I cannot imagine any single profession, including civilian profession, where 3 weeks would be remotely adequate to provide anybody with the necessary training so that they could do their job properly. I mean, from lawyers, electricians, accountants, plumbers, whatever, nobody who is doing a real job can, that kind of a job that requires skills, could possibly feel that they're trained up to the level to do it properly if that training lasts for only 3 weeks. And of course, fighting, being a soldier, is a job that requires a very high level of skills. I mean, anybody can see that, and especially high level of skills if you're going to be sent into battle, where it must be both terrifying and, you have all the noise and fog of war and all the pressures and stresses of battle around you. I mean, if you've only had 3 weeks training and you're thrown into that, well, not only do you know very little, but the chances are that you're going to forget, I would have thought, pretty much everything that you've been told, given that you've probably only been told it once, under the pressures of that kind of fighting. Now, this seems so grotesque that I wonder whether it's really true, and whether perhaps once these Ukrainian troops have gone through whatever training process they're going to get in Britain, they're going to be provided with some kind of further training once they return to Ukraine. Well, I hope so, because if not, then this is a callous and grotesque step, one which, to be honest, seems to me to be, well, it's not a war crime, but I mean, on any humane level, on an ethical level, it practically is one. It's sending essentially untrained men into battle against professional, heavily armed, well-equipped troops. And that seems to me to be a terrible thing to do. Well, I hope, as I said, that isn't actually the plan, and that once these people return to Ukraine, they'll be given more training in Ukraine itself. But I have to say that we are getting some extremely strange things coming out of Ukraine at the moment. I mean, I've already discussed the attack on the prisoner of war camp. There's the use of the mines, the dropping of the mines on Donetsk city. Now, it ought to be said that all of this is disputed, it's all denied. There's lots of reports that say that the Ukrainians weren't involved. This is all somehow the Russians doing these things. I've said previously, I don't really understand how that can actually be the case, but anyway, that's what some people are saying. And then, of course, we've also now had Ukrainian artillery strikes on the Zaporozhye nuclear power station. And what this is really strange is that on this occasion, as far as I could see, the Ukrainians aren't pretending that it isn't them who are launching these artillery strikes on the Zaporozhye power station. The justification for them doing so is that the Russians are keeping some of their troops and material there, that in other words that they're using the Zaporozhye power station to cover the presence of some of their troops. Well, that may be true, but what I would say is it still seems to me an extraordinary thing to actually launch artillery strikes against a nuclear power station, even though nuclear power stations, by the way, like bridges, are built to enormously high engineering standards, and they can probably absorb a great deal of damage. So one mustn't assume that these artillery strikes are in and of themselves. Any single artillery shell is going to create a disaster, but it does seem nonetheless an extraordinary thing to do. If the Russians are indeed hiding their soldiers and their systems on the territory of the Zaporozhye power station, well, that is a terrible thing. It'd be very wrong. But in that case, it seems to me that the right thing for the Ukrainians to do is not to engage in this recklessness of shelling this nuclear power station. It is to contact the International Atomic Energy Agency to insist on a proper inspection. The Russians have said that they're willing to undertake such an inspection, find out whether it is indeed the case that there are Russian troops there, and if there are, create an absolute international uproar and embarrass the Russians into withdrawing their troops. That seems to me to be the proper and correct thing to do, not to shell a nuclear power station on that kind of suspicion. I have to say that this all seems to me to build on an impression that I'm getting of increasing recklessness in some of the actions that the Ukrainian military is taking. And that doesn't really look good, and it does beg questions about the state of the Ukrainian military. And I have to say, if there really is a plan, which I hope there isn't, to send Ukrainian soldiers with only 3 weeks training into battle, then that would be consistent with this growing recklessness. Though I would also say that in that case, I am deeply troubled about Britain's role in facilitating this. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say about that. I'm going to return briefly to the topic of this Amnesty International report, which has attracted a huge amount of attention. There's been enormous criticism of in Amnesty from some people for publishing this report, criticizing Ukraine for citing its artillery and command posts in civilian areas. And I gather that the Ukrainian head, the head of Amnesty in Ukraine has now resigned and has dissociated herself from this report. I have to say, I'm somewhat baffled by the reaction. First of all, I think that it's been clear almost from the outset of the war that this has indeed been happening on a considerable scale. But as I've said previously in previous programs, it's something which the Ukrainians are doing, which may be very wrong, may be profoundly wrong, but which up to a point I can actually understand. Given that they're so heavily outmatched by the Russians, it's not perhaps surprising that they're trying to position their artillery where they think the Russians would be less willing to strike at it. So I'm a little perplexed that people have been so astonished and so angry about this. Firstly, because, as I said, it's essentially true, and I can recall Ukrainian officials all but admitting that it is true. And secondly, as I said, it's not entirely surprising that this sort of thing happens in what is, after all, a war in which Ukraine is fighting for its survival. So I'm not entirely clear, at least personally, why this has created all the uproar that it has. There's been some suggestions that what is really the cause of all of this anger is the fact that there's a report being published that criticizes Ukraine at all, and that some people are pointing to this as proof that Western attitudes towards Ukraine are shifting. Well, all I would say about that is that Amnesty International has a job to do. It doesn't always do it very well, and that's putting it mildly. I'm as critical of Amnesty as anybody is, but if it is the kind of organisation that it purports to be, then I would have thought that providing this kind of report is part of its job. And I think people who criticise Amnesty for this report, ought to take a step back and at least recognise that. Either they want Amnesty to be an organisation that does its job, or they want it to be purely a mouthpiece for the accepted orthodoxies in the West about who is right and who is wrong, and who fights perfectly and who fights badly. And they have to make a decision on what kind of amnesty they want to have. I'm sure that's a rhetorical question. I've no doubt which amnesty they want to have, and to be straightforward about it, they've largely got it. But I think in that case, they need to be a little bit more honest with themselves and perhaps honest with us. Anyway, there we are. The other big news today is yesterday is of the meeting in Sochi between President Erdogan and President Putin. Now, President Erdogan of Turkey and President Putin of Russia. Now, these two have had a long, complex, not always very friendly relationship, but they've always managed somehow to kiss and make up even after they've quarreled. And they seem to be moving steadily ever forward with their relationship with each other. And in my opinion, and this is a topic which we've discussed, we've already discussed, Alex Christoforou and I, on the Duran, but which perhaps could be taken further. I think this particular summit meeting is a watershed. Now, obviously, Erdogan and Putin have many things to talk about of a geopolitical nature. They've got to talk about Ukraine, obviously, about Syria, about Libya, about all of these conflict areas, Azerbaijan and Armenia, all of these conflict areas where quite often they've found themselves on opposite sides. But the big news is the extent of their economic cooperation. They're now talking about trade between Russia and Turkey, or Türkiye, as we're apparently now required to call it, of $100 billion a year. That's the target. For the record, that would put trade between Russia and Turkey at roughly the same, or Turkey, at roughly the same order of magnitude as trade between Russia and China. So Russian-Chinese trade is going to develop far beyond that level. But anyway, that's for the moment. And a transfer in settlements towards national currencies, the ruble and the lira, something which, by the way, might over time stabilize the lira, which is probably something that Erdogan would want, the Turkish lira. But ultimately, one can't help but see this as a massive reorientation of Turkey's economic and trading links from its traditional partners in Europe towards Russia and the East. Now one can see the logic in this. Turkey is in a position to provide many of the goods that the Russians might take time making for themselves, and which they need to circumvent the sanctions. A good example, for example, is furniture. Turkey has a long tradition in furniture making. Turkish marquetry, as I happen to know for myself, is of a very high standard. Turkey's pretty good at clothing and all kinds of things of that kind, and that would probably considerably assist the development of the Russian consumer goods economy, which is struggling at the moment to replace furniture supplies and textiles and buttons and things like that, which have up to now been supplied from Europe. So Turkey could fulfill an important niche there. But overall, and by and large, this looks like not just a reorientation of Turkey's economic future towards the East, but to be straightforward about that, an integration of its economic future with the East, with Russia, with Central Asia, ultimately with China as well. And of course, at the same time, Turkey is going to be the major remaining conduit of Russian gas via the Turk Stream pipeline into southern and central Europe, to places like Serbia, Hungary, some of the other Central European states, which are perhaps less keen on the sanctions war than the North European states, countries like Germany and the rest. So that's a major development if it sticks. There's going to be a major effort, I suspect, over the next few weeks, months, years, to try to prise Erdogan out of power in Turkey, that's my guess, in order to obstruct this. But to be honest, I also think that there's growing economic interest in Turkey in developing these links, because they do look more compatible with Turkey's needs, or Turkey's needs, than the traditional orientation towards the West. And I have to say that over time, I do wonder, and it's taken me a long time to reach this point, but I do wonder whether economic integration between Turkey and Russia on this kind of scale, and Turkey and the Eurasian states on this kind of scale, is ultimately compatible with Turkey's continued NATO membership. Now, can I just say, if Turkey leaves NATO, that is going to be a geopolitical earthquake. No country has ever left NATO after it has joined, and Turkey is a very big country. It's got a large population. It is strategically, pivotally important. It would be a geopolitical earthquake, far more important than Sweden and Finland joining NATO. Anyway, will that happen? That's all for the future, but it's interesting to see, again, the direction of travel, and that, it seems to me, is where we're heading. Well, this video has now gone on for almost an hour. I think this is the point where I stop. Thank you again for joining me today. We've covered a lot of ground in this video about current and future military developments, the propaganda, media war, if you like, public relations war, and about where Turkey is going. So more from me soon. Remember, you can find us on other platforms, Locals, Rumble, Odyssey, and Telegram. And of course, you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this channel. Please remember also to go to our shop and buy the great things that you will find there: our magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, and all the rest. And last but not least, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. I should say that I'm traveling to Greece tomorrow on what is basically a business trip, though it will have some leisure aspects. Whether I'll be able to do a video tomorrow remains to be seen, but one way or the other, I will certainly be doing programs from Greece, and I'll probably be meeting my colleague Alex Christoforou in Greece too, so we might be doing joint programs there. We'll see to what extent we can, and anyway, one way or the other, more from me soon.